Nativity, which has been a performance here in Seattle at the Intiman Theater. The Total Experience Gospel Choir has disbanded because Pat Wright, who has been directing it, was kind of at a point in her career where she was going to be moving on. So we will see what emerges from that. But that's who that was from. And the reason that I picked that Joy to the World song, how many have noticed that actually, even before Halloween this year, you could find Christmas melodies on the radio bands. That date, that date, it used to be after Thanksgiving,
right.
that there was a kind of celebration of the holiday.
Right.
In the Macy's Day Parade, Santa would come at the very end of the parade, and that was kind of like when Santa's arriving at the end of the parade, that was as it started. And it's inched back and inched back and inched back, so that, anyhow, I wanted to look at Joy to the World and hold it in the context of the monthly theme. My talk title for today, I didn't know how to technically do this, so imagine it in your mind. It's Advent-ures of Joy, happiness and fulfillment. And when you saw the word Advent-ures, put a little parentheses around the ers, the U-R-E-S. So it's Advent of joy, happiness and fulfillment. I'm talking about joy, and then happiness and fulfillment kind of as the ways through which we see joy in our lives. In my mind, when Mykal asked us to reflect on happiness, I find that happiness tend to be discrete moments in time, discrete outcomes, discrete events. Similarly, fulfillment often is if you've been looking towards making something happen, and it happens, then it's done, it's fulfilled. So joy is something that is the ground upon which happiness and fulfillment actually happens. That joy, when I came into Science of Mind teaching, I heard about something called God qualities. And it was a new way for me to be thinking about the way that the divine shows up. I grew up in the Roman Catholic Church. And in the Roman Catholic Church, basically God consisted of three parts. This was fundamental Catholic teaching. You know, there was the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And it was that relationship among the three that made that the one true God, which always confused me a little bit because it's like it's one God, but it's three parts. It's like, you know, it's like, so is it like a candy bar with that, you know, peanuts inside and the caramel and the chocolate on the outside? How could I really understand that three parts of the divine? Well, in Science of Mind, the way Ernest Holmes taught it, he similarly proposed three aspects to the divine. He talked about spirit or mind. He talked about the soul or the law. And he talked about the body. I think with Christmas time and the holidays, there can be a lot that gets caught up in the notion of well, a lot of times people will talk about baby Jesus. And they will talk about the experience of putting Christ back into Christmas. How many people have heard that admonition? Let's put Christ back into Christmas. I think that's a little bit challenging when we live in a society where the story, where Joseph and Mary set off, they had to get to a different place. They left their home and they had to come and be counted for taxation purposes. There was no vacation around this travel that they had. It was a governmentally mandated duty. You have to get to the place where that Joseph guy, where he was born. You have to get there. We don't really care if there are any exigencies, if there are any conditions that are going on that are going to make this a rough trip. Mary ostensibly being 9 months pregnant, I don't know how many people would feel, I mean, you were pregnant, how would that have been? Riding on a donkey, 9 months along the way. I mean, would that have been like, oh, take me, sign me up for that? It's not something, a particularly pleasant thing. If we root back to that notion of joy, sometimes our lives have those kinds of moments that Mary was going through. You know, I can't imagine that Mary's like, oh, Joseph, this is the best thing ever. This is what I've always wanted. This travel on the back of this donkey. And then we get there, and they didn't have faxes, they didn't have email, they didn't have Expedia, they didn't have Bing to help them. They arrived with no place to go. Now, I'm telling this story because we have a very similar story. For weeks and weeks before the election, we were hearing about this caravan, this dreadful, threatening caravan of people coming from Central America who were going to come to take over our country. And then we sent our military to the border to stand against these people. And let's be honest, what these people really are, it was not intruders from the Middle East who had bad designs on the United States. It was merely a vehicle to rally folks. And then a way to respond to folks was to hit them with tear gas. And to basically kill babies with tear gas. And to get out of this, the frame is, it wasn't bad tear gas, it was the gentlest tear gas. The fact of the matter is there's no such thing as gentle tear gas. There's only tear gas. So I invite us to consider the odd juxtaposition between the idea of putting Christ back into Christmas and our treatment of people. And I say our treatment because we may not agree with the policy that got enacted, but we're part of the country where that is happening. We're part of a community where I hate to admit it, but I have people in my life who support what that leader that we have, they support that person. And that can challenge my notion of how to be in a place of joy, how to let joy come into expression. Because it's a point in conversation where there's really not much in the way of give and take. It's like I can't understand them and they can't understand me. So coming back and leaning into joy lets me release it a little bit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to light this candle. And if you'll notice, I have 4 candles here in a little wreath. 3 of them are purple, 1 of them is pink. This is an expression of, call it an Advent wreath. And Advent, a word that comes into adventure, is a way of preparation, coming. Advent means to come. Adventure means to come into a risky situation. If we're to pursue happiness and fulfillment, if we're to pursue joy, there's a risk there. It's not just scot-free. It's not just we simply know it. I work in the Seattle School District, and I'm working now in a thing called a racial equity team. Since 1986, Seattle has again, ostensibly dedicated itself to reducing the disproportionality gap, the difference between outcomes for children of color versus affluent white children. And Seattle is considered, on a national standard, a high-performing school district. The problem has been that it hasn't been equitable in terms of the distribution. I give this background because there's been conversations about equity since '86. Where are we now? It's 22 years later, and we're still wrestling with it. A good movement has been that from 1984 to, or 1994, 2014, I'll land on the right year eventually, 2014 to 2016, there was an increase in the graduation rate among African American males. It went from 32% up to 60%. It went for white males up from 80% to 83%. So the amount gained for that particular demographic is a dramatic increase. It's still dramatically below, but it is a dramatic increase. So that's an instance where the conversation eventuated in some action. Sometimes we commit to things. We might say, I want to live in joy, but the way of seeing how it's coming about is where and when do we identify the happiness and the fulfillment? So obviously you might be starting to sense that I'm going to be giving some assignments about keeping track of the encounters with happiness and fulfillment. I lit the candle because the candle symbolizes this journey. It symbolizes the start of the journey. Traditionally, the idea of the first candle is related to hope. People walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in a land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. What if we are that light? For to us a child is born. Unto us a daughter is given. The government will be on her shoulders, and she shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty Everlasting Mother, Princess of Peace. Of the greatness of her government and peace there will be no end. She will reign over all realms, establishing and upholding them in justice, righteousness from this time on and forward and forever. Now, I was deliberate about changing the pronoun because how many people are familiar with the song The Messiah? He shall reign. What if we expand the he of the divine to the she? I mean, I think there's proportionally we've got more women in the room than we have men in the room. Proportionally, women are the ones that typically are much more engaged in their spiritual practice. The notion associated with this is hope. What is it to hope? That power of femininity, that power that looks to peace, that looks to solutions, that looks to making a home, that looks to all of those things that archetypally get associated with the female. What if we acknowledge that as the start of the adventure? What if the adventure, what if the Advent is our choice about staying right where we are and grounding ourselves in exactly the moment and the place that we are? Adventures are easy sometimes because it's about leaving behind where we were. How many of us have been in a place and we just left? I think there's a fair amount. And sometimes isn't it, I can say for myself, it's so much easier to make advances, to make changes in a different place. again, I can speak for myself, I can't speak for you all, but there are times that I can be different from where I grew up and how I was raised, and that little boy who grew up and how he was expected to act and how he was expected to be. It was much easier being something different in a totally different place. And I'm seeing some nodding, so I'm assuming that other people have had that encounter. The notion that I want us to hold on to with starting the adventure or starting the advent of hope is, how do we settle into who we are right where we are? When I have gone back to home, I have to work hard. I have to work diligently to be the new person I've become, rather than falling into the patterns that were so laid down. I have to be willing to have people say, "What are you doing?" "Well, hi, I'm doing me." "Well, that's not you. That's something completely different." You're right, it is completely different from how I used to be. But it's something that I have learned, and it's something that I'm taking on. "Well, I don't like it." You know, it actually took years before my family could say that, put those words on it, "I don't like it." It was much more subtle. It was much more, "Is everything okay?
Oh.
What's wrong with you? How can we fix what seems to be wrong?" And it's great that you brought that up, because sometimes that notion, that frame of, how can we fix you? I don't know about you all, but I know that being fixed by others tends to put me on the defensive. I tend to not be like, "Yes, I so want you to fix me." And especially when I've got a fairly solid, steady idea of who the you is and what the you's definition of my fixing entails. The other notion with this first candle, this candle of hope, related to the second coming of Christ. And that excites me, because rather than being at some apocryphal event in the distant future, the second coming of Christ, Ernest Holmes invited us to consider that each of us are the Christ presence. That we can pause and look inside and see Christ consciousness. We can see divine presence. We can see divine movement in, as, and through us. And if it's happening in, through, and as us, it's happening in, through, and as other people around us. So rather than establishing this notion of hope being some distant, faraway land that we can think, "Oh, isn't that nice? Someday this will happen." That we pause and we say, "No, it is happening right now. How am I called to be the Christ presence in the face of what is coming to me? How do I interrupt injustices?" I mean, it's funny, one of the pieces that really struck me the other day is the notion of, "Yeah, let's get the traditional Christmas, there's Santa." You know, Santa, what if we look at Santa as the emblem of the patriarchy? An old, white, powerful man who once a year does something good for people. and all the rest of the time is gone, is absent. The absent father, which was good enough for the patriarchy. The expected way of being is, you know, you're out doing whatever you do, and the little woman, she's taking care of what's going on at the household. And you give her her allowance, and she's fine. We are in a moment in society where there's a longing from a group of white men who are terrified. Terrified that primacy is at a risk. And ways to contend with that are, well, we're gonna limit who can vote. We're gonna limit the time that people can vote. What was it? The Speaker of the House was saying, I just don't get it how it is that California had this happen. Well, California had it happen because California actually counted the votes.
Oh.
They actually counted the votes. They didn't say, oh, time's up. We're done with the vote counting. We know that we didn't keep your polling place. We shut it down at the last minute. And that might look kind of fishy, but we didn't think there were enough bathrooms there. How do we be speakers of justice? How do we be speakers of the rights and well-being of each other? Martin Luther King said an injury to one is an injury to all. How do we come home to our Christ consciousness and own that when we see things happening to other people? Where are the places in our lives that we can speak up and say, this is an injury and we are responsible for responding to it? We have the capacity to respond to it. So the Advent, that second coming of the Christ, is in each of us, each moment of our lives. Now, I don't know about you. I don't know that every morning I wake up and say, I am the place of the divine, the Christ, that is coming into this day. But what if we took that little affirmation? I am the Christ that is coming into this day. One of the things that was talked about as an idea for the talk is also the practice of forgiveness. Because there are some times that my Christ consciousness is a little dimmed. That I'm not living in my full Christ consciousness. So to get to that, I can remember, oh, there's a little tool called forgiveness. Rather than just getting into that old pattern of, well, I didn't do the Christ consciousness thing, and it was really easy doing the not Christ consciousness thing. I'll just stay in that not Christ consciousness path. Oh, look, I fell off the path that I wanted to commit to. I can get back onto it just as easily. Now, it might have taken me some steps backwards. I might have lost some ground. But maybe there's something in this ground here that is of benefit. How do I look at this rather than think, I could have been here? How many of ourselves beat ourselves up because, we've made that progress. And now we look at ourselves and say, how did I backslide to this place? How did I do that? The problem is that we're buying into the story that either we're all on or we're all off. What if that slide backwards brings us to a place, to a presence, where our presence there again becomes an opportunity? I've talked about this before. I was on dialysis, and it was very discouraging because it was right after I had graduated from ministerial school. And one would think that if you're a minister, your consciousness should just be sufficient to heal everything that's going on. And yet I had encountered kidney failure. What was wrong with me? What was in my consciousness? And the thing was that in the dialysis center, that's where I met Kenny, the man that I've talked about. He was a Buddha. So my quote-unquote going backwards put me in the presence of the Buddha. This man who, they put in his kidney upside down and backwards. It failed. People make mistakes. This was a man who's like, you're not going to sue them for that? It's like, why would I do that? They're good, well-intended people. You know, there's another kidney out there for me somewhere, someday. He goes to the hospital because they were having a hard time getting the needles in the vein so that he could have the dialysis performed properly. He ends up with third-degree burns in the hospital. You're not suing, you're not having malpractice for them doing that? Why would I do that? It was an accident. Nobody did it to me deliberately. I was in the presence of the Buddha. I would never have known or encountered Kenny if not for my year on dialysis. My being 2 chairs down from him. My being able to see how Kenny could come in the morning and he'd be relaxed and he'd be at peace and he'd be easy. He'd be like, yep, here's my bag of Cheetos. And well, you're not supposed to. But I mean, Kenny would have his bag of Cheetos and he would have his Coca-Cola and he'd be eating his Cheetos, drinking his Coca-Cola while dialysis was going on. And he was just at peace about it. He was not going to let the dictates limit his experience of joy and fulfillment in life. Now, the judgmental part was, you know, Kenny, you really should, you know, the nurses would sometimes say, Kenny, you know, Cheetos really aren't the best food choice that you could be making here at this time. You know, that cola, you know how what we're trying to do with the dialysis is we're trying to take the fluid out of you, and when you're drinking your cola, you're kind of putting fluid back into you. And it's like, well, that's one of the things that's nice. You're getting the cola out while I'm getting it in now. So, we have the opportunity as the Christ consciousness, as the second coming of Christ, to look for it in ourselves and to look for it in each other. Yes, sometimes it's very difficult to see. Yes, there are some people, you know who I'm thinking of, probably. There are some people where it's very, very challenging to see Christ consciousness. It's really hard to see it when the seeming way of being in the world is me, 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 me. It can also invite us to look at our own times that we fall into selfishness. Sometimes a really big, bad character can remind us of our own shortcomings. And sometimes that really big, bad character is a great scapegoat for everything about ourselves that we don't love. So to be able to look at, okay, where and how have I gotten into judgment? Is this judgment, what is this judgment doing? That's what I invite you in your Christ consciousness. That's what I invite you with the advent, with the coming of joy, with the being present to joy, with being open to fulfillment and happiness. How does that place of judgment move forward the world? How does it move forward? Does it say, I am going to commit to doing what I can that more people have the power of their voice when they vote? I'm going to do what I can so that people who are hungry get food. How does our judgment perhaps inspire us to greater ways of being in the world? How does it help us connect with groups that are pursuing a mission that we value? How does it connect us to the Christ expression that is already going on in the world? Consequently, with today's talk, I invite you to 3 practices. Okay? First practice, be looking for those moments of happiness. Second, be looking for those moments of fulfillment. What have I worked for? Happiness is kind of like, look, it's here, it's come. Isn't this beautiful? I love that leaf on that tree. Oh my gosh, it just thrills me. How happiness comes about. It's just like this magic expression. People talk about the magic of Christmas. I love how those lights look as they're blinking. Happiness. Be open to the myriad ways of that it can manifest. Fulfillment is a little bit more of, I have committed to this, and this is coming about. And it may be some way that where our involvement has been very small, but we know that we are part of a bigger process. How do we see ourselves as part of a bigger thing that's going on? So it may be something that we have accomplished in and of ourselves alone, or it may be that we just pause and say, wow, I was part of this train of events. I was part of this moment in time that led to this. The last thing is about looking at where we are on our journey. If we've fallen back, if we haven't lived up to the Christ consciousness, if we're not fully embodying it, as we look at where we've come back, what is there? What is in this space where the Christ consciousness is being called forward? In that space, we can be forgiving ourselves. So forgive ourselves, and in that place of forgiveness, letting it go, be open to what can be received there. And again, the first two will help with that recognition. Consequently, I say, and so it is.
And so it is.
Thank you.